When we talked earlier, guys, and I apologize, I thought it was you, Joe, but it might have been you, Fletcher, that talked about, that some areas in the Northeast have access to incredibly cheap hydroelectric power, but they're very undeveloped. And having the high-capacity transport networks available that are becoming available because of these grants have created some additional demand.
That would be Maine. It could very well be true in the other Northeast states, but in Maine, there are remote rivers with dams on them and generate hydropower. Many of these were built 100 years ago, and so they were generating lots of power in the woods, and the power was used by paper companies, and paper was made there. The world has changed, the industry's changed. A lot of that is, it's hard for American paper companies to compete, particularly with what's been going on in Asia. And some of these plants aren't suitable to operate, but in some cases, they're not on the US grid. So if you can imagine a large dam generating, many megawatts of power, but there's no connection to the grid, and I've learned a lot about power in the last year or so, and that's kind of a big deal. Building an electric grid is pretty expensive, and it doesn't have to, these things are way out in the woods, and it just doesn't make any sense to build out the grid so they can sell the electricity in the U.S. This is so the thought is to make these places into data centers, because it's cheaper to do the fiber optics to them and ship stuff back and forth rather than as electricity, as electrons to ship it around as photons. Also in Maine, we've got a lot of wind power being built, capacity built. Again, it's built in the really rural areas. It's expensive to build the grid out to these, and it's created a lot of controversy because you're building big power lines, and people near big power lines or near a proposed big power line are not happy about it. So the University of Maine has been working on coming up with a whole new industry segment, which would be what they call a data mill, which is when you take an old paper mill and turn it into a data center. And there's one of the university's researcher goes around and said, no electron shall leave the state of Maine, it will all be photons, is his new model. And it's interesting. It's a way of importing and exporting data instead of electricity.
Good. All right, so we have medical, interconnection with other carriers, data centers, and bringing previously unseen businesses into the state. These are things that people never thought of, when they had very well thought out projects. So you see that bandwidth creates its own demand width, TM. I want to ask one last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Fletcher, why is your network, why is it open access, and how can the average CLEC get access to it?
I'm sorry.
Why is your network open access, and how can the average CLEC get it?
It was designed from the ground up to be open access. It is essentially tariffed. The company that owns the dark fiber is required to sell the dark fiber to all comers at a rate that they're required to publish with the PUC. And it's designed so that no one can go in by the size. 288 strands in rural Maine is a lot. By the size and by the requirement that nobody be able to buy more than 20%, it's designed so someone can't come in and buy it all up and create a monopoly. So talking to the private investors who put up the money, they said if someone comes in and buys if all strands get used, we'll build more. So there'll always be some available. Everyone should get the lowest price. There are volume discounts and term discounts, but that's pretty standard in the industry. You know, I think it was designed to be the epitome of open access, and it is. There's an address on one of the slides, or if anyone wants a card, for the people who sell the dark fiber. And I have a lot of personal ego invested in this, even though it's not my project anymore. I really want to see it work, so I'd be happy to turn you over to them. And if you don't, we would be delighted to sell anybody lit services on this network. And again, the sad fact is that all of our competitors have the same opportunity, and it looks like many of the regional CLECs at least will be selling services on it, and probably some actually larger national carriers.
Good. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, and I told the Comptel people we would end on time. Let's take a question from the audience.
This is for Joe Calzone. Yes. You mentioned that you were serving hospitals and higher education. By doing so, were you competing with the local providers? Was there a sense of resentment with you coming in, and how did you address that?
Good question. At the end of the day, our primary focus was middle mile, to be able to open up these underserved or unserved operating territories. As part of the grant, we agreed to bring fiber into 125 community anchor institutions. In 95% of those community anchor institutions, effectively those hospitals and universities, et cetera, got service through a duopoly. And generally that's Verizon and Time Warner Cable. So in upstate New York, Time Warner Cable has a very good footprint across. And I don't know that either one of those two companies were very supportive of public tax money being used for stimulating the growth of network infrastructure. So I don't think they were probably terribly pleased, but at the end of the day, we hired someone full-time to work and educate community anchor institutions, and with a overwhelming, resounding open arms, both the last mile service providers, CLECs, mostly in ISPs, as well as the community anchor institutions are excited about choice.
Can I
Sure.
answer that too? Actually, one minor detail of our project is there was money in there to build dark fiber out to anchor institutions. And the way that we dealt with that is an advisory committee was set up that had the incumbents on it, among other people. And they came up with rules on how this money would be allocated. And one of the principles was it made no sense to build fiber to places where there are already fiber. So if an incumbent already had a relationship and it built a fiber to a hospital, there wasn't going to be stimulus money for that. And there's no reason that the incumbents can't, and I think at least some of them have, apply. And the idea was, since it's only dark fiber, someone had to provide the service. So anchor institutions were working hard to educate them, and a bunch of them had, and they get in partnership with a provider, they provide for the money, and it's open to any provider. And it only goes to places where the incumbent already doesn't have fiber.
Okay, this will be the last question because we're...
Joe, I noticed you had a list of anchor institutions, right, that
Yep.
signed on to this project. Are those entities in a business relationship with you to cover the operating cost and provide the additional revenue for the network build-out? Or, how are you making your money on that? And then maybe the same question for you, Fletch. You got private investors as part of the match in the grant. Does the business model pencil out? Are you billing enough to do this in a reasonable period of time? Because that's one of the big questions that we have, is does it pencil out on the operating side, the business model, after it's built?
Certainly, the NTIA wanted 10-year pro formas, and rightfully so, a concern in terms of sustainability economically.
Yeah.
And from our perspective, we certainly had to make assumptions on the front end in terms of the pro forma. Having made those assumptions, hey, what X percent of the last mile providers are going to want service from us at this price, and the community anchor institutions, I'm very pleased to say the assumptions that we made are more than being fulfilled by now that we got the money and we're having the face-to-face conversations with the last mile service providers.
Okay.
As well, I'm feeling very good about
So
that.
you're working with last mile providers.
Absolutely.
Because you're a middle mile network. You're not
Correct.
going to NiserNet, for example, and doing endpoint connections.
We do both.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, hey, NiserNet they need to bring research and development network to Corning Research and Development Center.
Okay.
Here's a 10 GE.
Gotcha.
So I'm feeling very comfortable
Good.
in sustainability. We chose not to do the dark fiber model. I agree it's the route. Our challenge was we wanted to know that we could be sustainable economically, and I wasn't comfortable in the dark model.
And Fletcher model looks like it's going to pencil out as well?
So since it's dark fiber, the only thing that the company, after it's built, the only thing they have to cover is pole attachment fees
Okay.
and taxes.
Great.
And then they need to have a return on the $7 million, and it's $32 million investment, and they own it for $7 million. I leveraged my reputation to convince some people, private financiers that do nothing of telecommunications, that this was going to be a good idea. If it doesn't work out, I'll probably have cement overshoes and be in Casco Bay.
Okay, good end note. All right. All right, thank you to our panelists. They did a great job. Appreciate it. And stay tuned. Tom's got a good panel coming up next that will cover this subject in more detail. Thank you all.
Yeah.